So I looked up the name of the talk that I gave to someone, probably Amy, who does our newsletter, it's so beautiful, and our social media. And she sends me a note and says, could you give me a name of a talk for this week? So the name of my talk for tonight is Wise Action in a World on Fire. And it really has been the focus for me of my own practice to reflect on and consider what is Buddhism? What do Buddhist teachings have to say about how to respond? How to respond to a world on fire from the perspective of just climate change, right? We have a heating planet. I read, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, it was on the front page. It said that many organizations and the government are now having to take up the project of figuring out how to support particularly people in service industry and in manual labor, because people are dying from overheating. This is extraordinary. Like, this wasn't happening a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but it's happening now. This is the state of our world, of our external planet, and the impact that it's having on us. And of course, if we look at not the climate element of a world on fire, but we look at the human, the relational, the political, it's really hard. It's really hard to read the news every day and to see the proliferation of violence, of war, of homelessness, of displacement. So if you are like me, and I hear this again and again from people, this question, what should I do? What should I do? And on one hand, there's so many things you can do. There are many, many options, you know. You can protest, you can give money, you can write letters, you can, on one hand, it's endless, the different kinds of things that one can do. And yet, so often it feels insufficient, you know, the enormity of what we're facing. So Buddhism has something to say about what to do, which falls in this category. It's one of the steps, step number 1, 2, 3, 4 of the Eightfold Noble Path, called wise action. And wise action is a set of guidelines or precepts that give us orientation about how to behave. And for some time, I've been really focused on the center steps, 3, 4, 5 of the Eightfold Noble Path: wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, which fall under what's called the sila, the ethics kind of bucket of the path. So the path has the wisdom component, the ethics component, and the what's called bhavana, or mind training, what we know as meditation. And it feels to me so often that, again, especially in Western culture, we tend to kind of jump over the ethics part. And there's good reason for that. Any of us who've grown up in a sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, ethics feels a lot like a slap on the hand, can feel kind of tight and punitive, and can just immediately invoke, the inner critic and having us feel like we're not doing enough and we're not good enough and like that. Really, from a Buddhist perspective, and this is a way of reclaiming this part of the path and even our own understanding of what ethical behavior is. This part, this sila dimension of our path and practice, it's heart practice. It's about our behavior. It's about, therefore, our relationships. And if there's anything we need to understand more about now, it's how can we get along? How can we live together well? How can we find a way to be less divided, less divisive, less quick to make some other, and who that other is will be different for different people, but we're so quick to make an other and then make the other bad, make the other into the enemy. And this tendency, this trend just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse in my experience, and less capacity to bridge the divide, to bring a sense of curiosity, of openness, of interest in someone who has a very different perspective from ours. And so the gap keeps widening. And in that widening gap, it's filled with violence, with hatred, with dysfunction. It's very, very painful. So we have this question, what do I do? Right? What do I do? And what do I do is an important question. And Buddhism, I think, really important to know that Buddhism is not pacifist. I'm going to get the word. It's not passive, right? So many of us have taken up Buddhist practice through meditation, which can feel very passive. I sit here with myself, quietly. That's our practice. Meditation practice is about learning how to be with the whole range of our experience without putting fuel on the fire, without making things worse, without adding, but learning how to be with our experience so that we can respond in a way that is intentional, skillful, kind, wise. I've been talking a lot lately about the fact that, the Buddha, two things about the Buddha. First of all, he also lived in really difficult times, tremendous social and cultural upheaval in his own lifetime. And he himself, I'll throw this word out and see what you think, he himself was a social revolutionary. He did not only walk around contented, smiling all the time. He did all kinds of social action. The founding of the Buddhist Sangha was pushing up against the cultural norms, the caste system of his time, because he invited everyone in. He was ongoingly in conversation with kings and leaders to try to talk them out of violence. He didn't always succeed. As I've said recently here, I think the Buddha's own family was decimated in a war by a warring neighboring clan. His clan was the Sakyas, and they were killed off by the Kolyas. So this was not someone who was sort of Pollyanna about let's all be peaceful and happy together. He too lived in difficult times. But the important thing is that from a Buddhist perspective, while it's important to take action, it is equally important to pay attention to where our actions are coming from. That we look within, because what is happening here is reflected there, right? So we say, I described a world on fire, and some of you may be familiar with sort of a famous teaching from the Buddha that's called the fire sermon. The fire sermon is not about the fires in the external world. The fire sermon is about the fires that we harbor in our own minds and hearts. I'll read you just a little bit of it. He says, friends, everything is burning. And what is the everything that's burning? The I is burning. Forms, external forms are burning. I consciousness, seeing, is burning. Eye contact, when the eye makes contact with an object, is burning, and whatever is felt as pleasant or painful, or neither pleasant nor painful, that too is burning. He's giving an example of how a moment of experience arises through the eye. But he also goes on to say the same is true with all the other sense organs. Same is true for the ears, same is true for the nose, same is true for the tongue, same is true for touch and the mind. Because in Buddhist psychology, the thinking mind is understood as a sense organ. So just as the eyes create seeing, the mind creates thoughts. This is kind of revolutionary for us because we think our thoughts. But thoughts happen, right? I just read a friend had in a newsletter that she put out this great quote from Krishnamurti, who's an Indian sage. And Krishnamurti said, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, I think. He said, "You think you are thinking your thoughts. You are not. You are thinking the culture's thoughts." We are part of a world which infuses how we see, how we hear, how we smell, how we taste, and definitely how we think. So, from a Buddhist perspective, the first thing we want to do is put out the fires here, attend to our own mind, our own heart, so that, not so that we become passive, but so that, in the simplest language, we can respond skillfully rather than reacting, rather than adding fuel to the fire, as it were, right? So I want to go back to the Eightfold Path because I think that it helps us frame, if we see the context of wise action, it can help us really frame our own reflection about this question, what do I do, right? And what we find is that wise action falls in, as I said, this basket of sila, of ethics, but it is informed by what's called the wisdom basket, which is wise view and wise intention. So I think of it this way. This is my new way of holding the Eightfold Path, which is always shape-shifting for me. So rather than thinking of the Eightfold Path as 8 steps, it's often described as a wheel with 8 spokes, right? And what happens when we have a wheel with 8 spokes and we attend to some parts and not others is we get what's called a wheel out of round, which is one of the definitions of dukkha. For any of you who've ever had a flat tire on your car, on your bicycle, you know what it's like. Thunk, right? That's a kind of suffering. And my perspective is that in America, especially, the translation of Buddhist teachings has focused almost exclusively on the seventh step of the Eightfold Path, which is wise mindfulness. We've kind of taken, as we are apt to do in a Western orientation, take one piece out of context and focus on it and forget that it's part of a whole. So looking at it in a more holistic perspective, if you think of wise action at the center, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, as ethics, as our behavior, as the practice of the heart, the practice of compassion, how can we live together? That practice is informed by wisdom and it's deepened by our meditative practice, by bhavana. So I was saying earlier, and I think important to underscore, that from a Buddhist perspective, what we do is shaped by where we do it from, by the state of our heart and mind. And I'm going to read to you from the opening lines of the Dhammapada, which is one of the earliest texts on of Buddhist teachings. This is what it says. Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds, everything we think and say and do, all deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one acts or speaks with a deluded mind, a confused mind, suffering follows. As surely as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox pulling a cart. He's using an image from his time, right? So when we act from a place that comes from delusion, that comes from greed, hatred, or delusion, suffering follows. Inevitably, surely. And then he says the opposite. Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a serene mind, you might say a clear mind, an aligned mind, happiness follows as surely as one's shadow. So this is the teaching of karma. Karma means action. And those of you who've listened to me for a while will know I often talk about an arc of karma, right? Karma has been translated in our culture as something like fate. And it actually means pretty much exactly the opposite of fate. Karma is not fate. Karma means that every moment of thinking or speaking or doing something has an intention, an action, and an impact. Think about it. Everything you think and say and do has an intention, an action, and an impact. Now, ultimately, our job as practitioners is to learn to stay awake through that whole arc, to be aware of our intention, to stay awake as we act, and to notice the impact. However, most of you will recognize that staying awake in the heat of the moment, as it were, is pretty hard, right? Sometimes we can do it if we slow things down, but often when we take action, we're just in it, right? We can pay attention to the impact, but to do that requires interaction. We don't really know the impact of what we say or do from our side. We have to get input from others. This is one of the great lessons of being a Dharma teacher. I often think, I said something terrible and actually it was really helpful to people, or I said something that I thought was great and it's really upsetting, right? But I don't necessarily know that until I get input. So that's the impact side. The action side is difficult to stay awake during, but the intention, where is it coming from, my action, right? And the Buddha is reputed to have said something like, all karma hinges on intention. We don't control the outcome. We do need to pay attention to the impact, but we don't control what happens. The Buddha said, if you try and understand karma, you will go crazy. This is because it's not linear. It's not like billiard balls, right? A bumps into B, bumps into C. It's more, I always use this motion. It's like this wild confluence of events coming together in any moment, right? And like I said, we think we're thinking our thoughts, we're thinking our culture's thoughts. Well, any moment of experience, we're not in charge. We're part of this dynamic. So I like to say, you are not you are 100% responsible, but you're not to blame. You're not to blame because it's many things come together to create the expression of speaking or acting. But you are completely responsible because it's useful to pay attention to your intention and do the best you can, not to act from greed, hatred, and delusion. And if you do, to notice the impact, to get the feedback and maybe say you're sorry. It's actually pretty good saying you're sorry. Doesn't happen very often. I had this recently with a friend who said something kind of stupid to a mutual friend. And when the person who said the dumb thing went and said in real sincerity, I'm so sorry. That was just dumb what I said, and it was insensitive and like that. And very quickly, But if we don't apologize, right? If we don't have the humility to do that, then often, as I was describing, the gap, the rift gets wider and wider, right? So, how do we support skillful action, wise action, given all this backdrop? If we look at the Eightfold Path, it gives us some orientation, right? That we begin from the place of wise view. And wise view, I think of as, many of you heard me say this probably, you're standing at the top of the mountain looking at a 360-degree view, and where do you focus? And the Buddha was very clear about this. He didn't focus on metaphysics. He didn't focus on magical powers. And that great story about the Buddha picking up a handful of leaves and saying to the monks, are there more leaves in my hand, or are there more leaves on all the trees of the forest? And the monks say, there's more leaves in your hand. I'm sorry, in the forest than in your hand. And the Buddha says, just so. The things I understand are as many as the leaves on the trees, but the things that I teach are just this handful. And what is that handful? It's embedded in the Four Noble Truths. Sometimes we say, I teach that the Buddha said, which I don't think he actually said, but it's a good summary. I teach one thing and one thing only: suffering and the end of suffering. The Buddha was interested in human distress. That he was willing, he had enough courage to turn and face it directly, right? And not to dash in and try and fix it, which usually just makes things worse. You know how it is? If you're like having a hard time and you go talk to someone about it and they try and fix you, ugh, it's the worst, right? It only makes you feel more broken, right? And misunderstood. But if someone's willing to listen, if someone's willing to be with, that's what we're practicing in meditation with ourselves. So we don't turn away and ignore, and we don't rush in to fix. We allow our hearts to be tenderized so that we can begin to tolerate being with our own and others and the world's suffering. This was the view of the Buddha. When he's talking about wise view, he's talking about pay attention to human suffering. Pay attention to what's needed to relieve human suffering. Right? What does freedom really look like? What is that? And from that view, imagine again, you're standing on the top of the mountain and you look and say, this is the direction I want to go. Then you make a vow, you make a commitment, you declare your intention. This is what I care about. This is wise intention, the second step. And in some way, this is, I pull on my training in Zen for this, but in some way, I think the whole of the path is about shifting from living a karmic life to living a dharmic life. And what I mean by karma in this case is kind of reactive habitual action. And instead, we're living by vow. We're living by taking the time to consider what's really important, not as a task to complete, but what's important, like, how do I want to show up in the world? Not so much what do I want to do, but who do I want to become? And then we don't sit on our hands and not act, but all of our actions come from that deep alignment with what we care about, that deep alignment with what matters most. I don't think I have so much. Oh, so my premise is that these two parts, this wisdom basket of the path, are really meant to inform ethics. They're meant to inform wise speech and wise action and wise livelihood. So when we behave, when we ask ourselves, what should I do? We want to pause for a moment and consider, who do I want to become? What's most important to me? And then how can I choose a path of action that's in alignment as best I can, right, with that? And it doesn't mean we're going to do it perfectly. We will not. The problems that we're facing, the extraordinary degree of violence and divisiveness in our world is not like I'm going to do something and be able to fix it. I'm not. But we together, if each of us does our best to practice the capacity to be with our own difficulty so that we build the ability to respond to the world's difficulty, and we take the time, we engage in the wisdom of reflecting for ourselves on which direction do I want to go and where do I commit myself. That means when we're in this world of, I think I can just say, overwhelm, that we have some way to begin to sift and sort what to say yes to, what to say no to. Otherwise, you know how it goes. We could spend a long time binge watching whatever it is, or posting selfies on whatever it is, right? Those things, and I'm not saying this from a holier than thou place, I do those things, right? But I've come to see for myself, those actions, it's a variation of those actions, those are the culture's thoughts, the culture's orientation being played through me. And I have a choice, not an easy choice, to say, no, I want to do this. This is what I care about. And I just, well, this is confession. I have been noticing how quickly in the morning I reach for my phone. Anyone else have that problem? And in my case, my phone acts as a medical device. So many of you know I'm type 1 diabetic for 50 years. I wear a device on my arm that checks my blood sugar levels and it talks to my phone. So I kind of need to have the phone in order for this to work. But that truth doesn't mean that the first thing in the morning I can pick up my phone, I can check my blood sugar. I could put it down, but I don't, right? I look at my email, I go to the New York Times, I read the opinion articles, I play word games, and then half an hour later, I get out of bed and I feel like hell because I've just been swept into what I'm calling the culture's thinking, the culture's actions. It's not what I care about. And often what it means is that the things that I do care about, like doing my meditation practice or getting exercise, stretching, taking care of my body, those things go by the wayside because the pull is so strong. So the confession, I've tried many things to shift this and have largely failed. So I'm trying again. And this time, the thing that I think will help me the most is not my strategy or willpower, but that I've asked a friend to help me out, right? So I have someone else who has a similar phenomena, as many of you may, and she and I agreed that we're going to help each other, and say, like, what's helping us behave in the ways that we want to behave and what's getting in the way and how can we support each other. And this is how we walk the path, especially in the complexity of today. We each are responsible for our own behavior, and we can't do it alone. We need each other. We need each other's support, because what we're being bombarded with is, simple way to say it is, it's not the Dharma. It's all kinds of things that are pulling for our attention, right? I highly recommend to anyone the book that I am about halfway through now called Stolen Focus, which is about this phenomena, how these systems are intentionally taking the most precious thing we have, which is our attention. So when we hear ourselves asking, what do I do? It's a really good question. Let yourself feel the ache that's generating that question. And let yourself pause and consider, what is your orientation? What is your commitment? What do you care about before you take action? And don't expect that your actions will be spot on and perfect and so on every time. They won't. But if you engage in this way, you put yourself into a feedback loop where you're constantly in a process of learning. There is no there exactly in Buddhist practice. It's all about doing the best we can, together doing the best we can. Because like the Buddha, when we turn and face the world, we see so much suffering. And if we are sensitive human beings, we feel that suffering. And so the question is how to respond. So I will pause there and invite, please, if you have questions about anything I said, or you have a complaint or comment. Like all of you, I am finding my way in this territory and doing my best to let the Dharma, let the teachings inform me. But as I said, it takes all of us. And burning represents constant change. I think that that's one way to say it. The world is burning, meaning you can't hold it, right? It's changing. But burning is also a reference to greed, right? That everything is burning, and greed is shorthand for greed, hatred, and delusion. which are sometimes referred to as the three poisons. So the basic idea, everything is burning, means, and you can check this out in your own experience, that moment by moment, we are being flooded by pleasant, unpleasant, and what's called neither pleasant or unpleasant or neutral experience. And when something is pleasant, we're greedy, we want it. And when something's unpleasant, we tend to push it away. So that's greed and aversion. And at the heart of that is what's called delusion or confusion, that we misunderstand who we are, that we imagine that we are each some kind of separate, solid, unchanging self. That's where the no change comes, the changing comes in. And we forget that we're connected to everything else. So the fire sermon is a way of talking about sort of, I like it because it's so visceral, right? The experience of that, right? It's how you might feel in the world as you're being bombarded by stimuli. That's the burning, 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 wanting, and the aversion. This is burning. I remember a story about His Holiness the Dalai Lama being driven in a car through, maybe it was Rodeo Drive or something in LA. And afterwards he said something like, as he drove by and looked in the windows of all of these, beautiful things, he said, I wanted things I didn't even know what they were. This is our culture. This is materialist, capitalist culture. It wants us to want. This is burning, right? Burning, burning, like that. Yeah. And for now, let's do a dedication, and hopefully I've planted a few seeds that will support you to be in alignment, have your actions be in alignment with what you care about. So, just taking a moment to feel whatever's been touched or stirred in you this evening. And offering any goodness, any insight, any questions, any inspiration that may have come from our gathering together this evening, in words and in silence. And opening our hands, opening our hearts, offering any benefit of our taking in the Dharma. May it be for the benefit of all beings in all directions. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be safe and free from harm. And may we, together with all beings, awaken and be free. Thank you, my friends. Take care. I hope you enjoy the holiday tomorrow for those of you who have one. And we'll see you next month. Bye, everybody.